Thank you so much for meeting with me.
Oh, it's my pleasure. It's good to see you again.
You've had quite a year.
Yeah.
Yeah. It was really a thrill to play your piece at the BSO.
Oh, thank you. I was so excited to see you there. Like, yeah, I know that. I recognize you.
Yeah, I'd love to know what influences you had as a young child that
Ooh,
has shaped um, your music today.
born in Tehran, in Iran, and I was born in 1985. So that's, for some historical context, right in the middle of the Iran-Iraq War. I was very young when the war ended, so I have very few memories of it. I mostly remember the fear of something being about to happen, like a bombing of Tehran. I remember the fear in my parents, in my family. I don't remember so much the actual events of the war, but of course the war culture lasted throughout the time I was in Iran. I mean, it influenced education, it influenced um, cinema, poetry, everything, music. It was everywhere. So that's the kind of culture that I grew up in.
So, how old were you when you left Iran?
I was 17. Yeah, so you were conscripted as a boy at 17. And once you're conscripted, means you have to go to military service. They won't give you a passport until you've finished your military service. That you can't exit the country as easily. And there are some conditions under which you can, but it becomes much more difficult. So I had to leave right before I was conscripted. It's a long story. Of course, my parents had applied for immigration to Canada, but our visas hadn't arrived yet, so we had to leave before I was conscripted. And that's when you turn 17 by the Iranian, or maybe turn 18 by the Iranian New Year. I think that's when you're conscripted.
What was the music like that you were exposed to?
Um, what was the music like? So the Iranian government, being a conservatively Islamic government, had a rocky relationship with music post-revolution. So there was a lot of, they advocated for the Persian traditional music a little bit, but anything that had Western influence as much as possible, they cut ties with. And music education was very much discouraged. I wouldn't say it was illegal, but it was close to being illegal. Um, and so even though the government had this kind of problem with music in some ways, they still used it uh, as a tool for propaganda in many ways. So there was a lot of during wartime, there was a lot of war influenced music. There was a lot of music kind of encouraging and motivating people to fight, to go to war, and showing how this is something honorable. So imagine a lot of music with choirs singing in unison, kind of trying to unite people, and nationalistic music. This kind of thing was all over the place. And then there was music that was influenced by the Persian traditional music. Then there was also music that is influenced by the um, mourning. They do a lot of mourning for the loss of the kind of um, influential Muslim figures. And so there's a lot of music associated with that, and that music also dominated the media. And because the media is controlled by the government, we only have government-controlled media, we don't have access to private channels. The music that they fed you was all the music that you had access to. So that's kind of the music that I grew up with. I heard very little classical music as a child. I heard a little bit of it, but very little. Um, Heard very little pop music. We had a little bit, and that was illegal. So pop music mostly was being produced in Los Angeles. So there's an area in Los Angeles where a lot of the Iranian musicians who were active pre-revolution, they immigrated there, and then they continued to make music there. And then those music, through the cassette tapes that were being illegally replicated, they would pass hands, and they were very common in Iran. So that music was also something that my parents would listen to a lot, so I had to listen to. I wasn't particularly fond of it. I listened to it a lot. And then by the time I was a teenager, I think the country freed up a little more, and pop music was starting to make its way in. I think classical music was also kind of being performed a little more. But yeah, music education was very much discouraged. And when I was a child, I started very late. I started when I was around 11 years old to play piano or to study piano. We had this little Casio keyboard in our home that we had somehow acquired. And this, as time went by and nobody used it, this became a toy for me. When I was much younger, I wasn't allowed to touch it because it was this precious instrument. But it gradually became a toy, and my parents noticed I was spending more and more time at this, and I guess I must have played things that impressed them, and they thought maybe there's something there, so they got me a piano teacher, and that's how I got started. I played on that Casio keyboard for about 1.5 years before we finally got a piano, and you know, it still is very difficult in that society to be a musician for multiple reasons. One is cultural. You know, coming right out of a war and having the economic challenges that the country had, most parents wouldn't want to encourage their children to go into music, where you would most likely not have a future in terms of making an income. I mean, it's difficult enough in this society. You know, in Iran, it's nearly impossible. So, you know, it's a culture that produces binary careers. You're either an engineer or a doctor. My parents really had to go against a lot of wise counsel to get me a piano teacher. And even then, you know, at that time, I was completely oblivious to the fact that the society had, or certain parts of the society had a problem with me studying music. So I was at a religiously conservative school. It was a very good school, but it was very conservative. And one of my teachers saw me doing this on the school desk. And so I was like, "What are you doing?" I said, "I'm learning to play piano." I said, "Oh, okay, piano." So a few days later, he calls my dad to school, and he has prepared this contract for us, saying that his piano playing is interfering with his studies. So it's going to be either piano or school. If he doesn't quit, we'll expel him, basically. And so from that point on, I mean, I was lucky enough that my parents saw through that. And we signed the contract, walked out, and I continued playing piano, and I just didn't tell them about it from that point on. But that's the kind of environment in which I was studying music.
Wow.
Long answer.
No, it's fascinating. It reminds me of some of the things that happened in China during the Cultural Revolution.
Well, we had a cultural revolution. That is
Yeah.
a very similar thing, yeah.
Yeah. So then I'm curious about when you first heard Beethoven, because you wrote this beautiful, powerful piece, and I feel like you're connected with Beethoven, what he was saying with his symphonies and his humanity, and I want to touch on that later. But I'm curious to know from your youth how you grew up. When was the first time you heard Beethoven, and what did you think? Do you remember what that felt like?
Yeah, I think my introduction to most classical composers wasn't through hearing them, like it is for most people. It was through playing them. So probably with Beethoven, it was through playing the short piano bagatelles, and then I remember playing one of his piano sonatas when I was in Iran. But I think what really interested me in Beethoven was reading a book by Heinrich Neuhaus. It's called The Art of Playing Piano, I think. It's out of print in English, but they still print it in German. So he was a piano teacher for, you know, Richter and Emil Gilels, a lot of influential pianists of the 20th century. And he talks in that book about not understanding Beethoven himself as a teenager. The other way. Understanding Beethoven and his philosophy, his musical philosophy, but not quite technically being able to play his music.
Huh.
And I found that so fascinating, just the idea of a composer being a philosopher. And I was just reading about this without really knowing Beethoven's music much. The idea of a composer being something more than just someone who writes music, and being able to communicate ideas, bigger ideas, important ideas through music, that was such a fascinating concept to me. And I think that's something that really drew me to Beethoven, and really got me interested in understanding his music and seeing how he's able to do that. And then seeing that he's in many ways an activist, how his music is so autobiographical, romantic in many ways, and basically tells the story of his own life. I found all of those things fascinating, being able to tell a story through music.
I love that the fact that you use your music to almost heal, I feel. I mean, I shouldn't put words in your mouth, but I sense that from listening to some of your music. Like, I was actually listening to Color of Freedom last night, and oh, it's so beautiful. And my sense is that it's a very healing piece. And I don't know if that's what you intended in writing it, but I also feel like with the Jederbaumspricht as well, it's trying to heal the planet through your music.
I think I'm optimistic usually in life, and I try to convey hope. And I think that's something that Beethoven also had. I think a lot of his music conveys hope. I mean, you have the Fifth Symphony, that Jederbaumspricht is, is in dialogue with that. It starts with this ambiguous C minor section and then ends with page after page of C major chord just playing away. So I mean, that's hope. And the Ninth Symphony, of course. Color of Freedom is a good example. You mentioned that. I think that's an example of a piece that I was trying to tell a story through it, but I think as I was writing the piece, because it was inspired by events that affected me emotionally so much, I felt that I needed that healing myself. And I think it did end up being that way. And I think for me, some of the most meaningful musical collaborations and musical work that I've done has been through human connection more than actual music. I think that's a piece with which I have a lot of really fantastic memories, because every time it was performed, someone in the audience came to me and told me a story, or something happened in the process of performance that just reduces you to tears. And those memories get attached to the piece of music. So every time I hear that piece, those memories kind of run through my head. So that's a piece that's very meaningful to me. And same with Jederbaumspricht, because of the circumstances under which it was performed, I think it became a very meaningful piece.
So the duo you wrote for In Tandem also reflects the changes in climate, how it's affected the habitat of, in this particular piece, the gazelle. So I have a couple questions about that. So when you first wrote your draft, you experimented with microtones and the rich harmonies that the Persian music has, that includes those kind of microtones, which I try to absorb because it's a foreign language for me. I feel like Western music hasn't caught up with how to notate those kind of things or how to hear that. So I was a little bit disappointed that it disappeared from your duo. But I would love to know a little bit about your thought process in terms of experimenting with that. How much have you used microtones, and how you decided not to use it in this particular duo?
Yeah, well, I mean, the piece is inspired by a Persian poem. It's one of the earliest known Persian poems written in an Arabic meter, and we can talk about the story behind that. But speaking to microtones and using some of the different accidentals that are used in the Persian dastgah music, I felt that I wasn't really at the place where I was comfortable enough to communicate those effectively to the performers. I feel like if I'm using those, I should not only be able to compose using those microtones, but to be able to communicate with the performers who are interested in playing my music exactly what I'm looking for. And I didn't quite feel like I was at that level of comfort with that, even though this is music that I grew up with, as I was telling you earlier, and the sounds of it are in my ear. I feel like bringing that into the language of Western classical music takes a higher level of proficiency that I don't quite feel comfortable with. And I'd like to get there. I think it's one of those things that it's definitely, I'm working towards it, which is why for the workshop, I felt that was a great opportunity for me to try doing that. But yes, what was your other question?
I feel like we failed you.
No.
But it's also, well, that actually, there's a couple questions actually I just thought of is that a lot of the Western classical audience is not so accepting of new sounds and language. And so how can we bring the audience to be open-minded about that? Because so often I think people come to concerts and they look and see, oh, there's a contemporary composer on the program. Oh no, instead of opening up to, oh, this might be an interesting experience. And then it's like tasting something unusual and not, and you have to taste it like 5-6 times before you can actually decide, do I like it? But in a concert, you only listen to these pieces once, and then a lot of people will say, well, did you like it? It's not really fair to the ears or brain with that one listen, I find. But do you have any thoughts about how we can open up our ears to be accepting, more accepting, and not have a preconceived idea of what contemporary music might be?
I think this is a great point you bring up. I mean, speaking of microtones, this is one of those things that to many people's ears, if they're not familiar with it, it might just sound like the performers are playing out of tune. Of course, if you're hearing it happen time and time again, then you might realize, okay, there's a pattern here. But still, it might sound very foreign to people's ears because they're not, their ears are not used to constructing those harmonies or filling out the notes in between, you know. So that's definitely part of the challenge that I faced in this piece. I feel like if I'm using those microtones, I will need to set it up in such a way that they're recognizable for what they are, and I was using them outside of the construct in which they're usually used. So that was definitely one of the considerations. But how can we get people used to these new sounds? That's really through diversifying our concert experiences, diversifying it stylistically much more. I mean, the classical music, so-called classical music concert experience is very much European-centric still. It's not just European-centric in the way the programming works, but aesthetically, we very much think in a European way, and the way it has developed when we adjudicate these pieces, when we think about them in terms of quality. That's the standard that we use. And, you know, music from different parts of the world can have different kinds of strengths. So speaking for Persian music, this is music that is melodically so incredibly rich. And there's so much emotion, so much you can pack into the movement between two different notes and the interval between two different notes, so much that can express that I feel are not as easily possible in music of many other cultures. And yet, you know, if you look at harmony in Persian music, it hasn't developed to the same extent that harmony and counterpoint has developed in Western classical music. And that's partly because music has, the governments in Iran have had a rocky relationship with music for so long. So musicians haven't been able to gather together and to play together. So that music is often created by individuals or in very small groups and not as much by large groups. So, there are things like that that affect those developments. But when one area of music is kind of abandoned, another area gets more focus. So, being able to listen to those things, it takes diversifying our concert experience. So we can listen to more voices, we can listen to more aesthetics, and be more accepting of it, and be willing to listen to new things and take them for what they are. And it takes time. It takes time. It's a cultural change, and cultural change is always slow. I think a lot of good steps are being taken in that direction. So hopefully 50 years from now, it'll be very different.
We're taking baby steps, but I think we are making steps in the right direction. I think as a performer, I think it's really upon us to try to present the pieces in the best possible light. And I find sometimes these pieces are not giving enough rehearsal time, and and almost programmed because they're supposed to program it, and then it's not really fair to the piece, because I mean, if you're going to serve Brussels sprouts to somebody who doesn't like Brussels sprouts, you want to have the best Brussels sprouts possible, right? To try to convince them, right? You have to present these pieces in the best light. Tell me a little bit about this poem that this piece is based on.
So this is a poem attributed to Abu Hafs, and it's written in the 8th century. So it's basically asking a question, how a mountain gazelle can be expected to run in a plain and to survive without any companions. And what I found fascinating about this poem is that the idea of displacement, at least at the literal level for this poem, the idea of displacement of an animal has been a concern for artists as far back as the 8th century. I found that fascinating because growing up, in a war-torn country, I wasn't really aware of climate change as much. I could see its effects, and I could see the causes of it. Tehran is one of the most polluted cities in the world, so I could see that we had, I mean, there were weeks, 2 weeks in a year where they would close down schools because it was so polluted. They would basically ask people to stay home, turn on their kettles, close the windows, and back then it happened, every now and then. I think nowadays it's a regular event. It's almost annual every year. They have a couple of weeks like that. It would get so polluted that you couldn't see 2 blocks down the road.
You couldn't see what?
2 blocks down the road, you couldn't see.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so I could see the pollution, and I could see that there was a shortage of water and droughts and all of that. But to kind of connect that all to the concept of climate change, I wasn't as aware of that. And as I learned more about climate change, I was blown away to learn that scientists have been talking about this for decades, and it just seems that people are not taking it seriously enough. And as you know, I'm studying climate change in like a directed study course through the Gabriela Lina Frank Creative Academy of Music, and we're very early on in our learning process. We've only been reading for about 6 weeks now. But what I've learned so far is that it is just so much worse than I had ever thought it to be, and that many of the models that are even being presented to us are the best case scenario models, and it's probably going to be much worse than that. And we've already passed so many red lines. But anyways, finding that this has been a concern for so long for humanity, and that it's been in the arts. And I think as artists, as composers, it's our responsibility to tell these stories, and seeing that these stories have been told for centuries now, it was just fascinating to me. So this poem, written in the 8th century, it's written shortly after the Arab conquest of Persia. So after Islam comes to Iran, and after the Arab conquest, the official language of Iran changed to Arabic from Persian for a while. And the Persian culture has been so strong throughout the centuries that it's always survived these kinds of invasions. And so after a couple of centuries, the Persian language makes a comeback. So this is one of the first surviving poems from that era when Persian language is kind of coming back. And this poem in many ways might be talking about that issue of identity. That as the mountain gazelle could be the poet that is expected to survive in a language to which he does not belong. It could be meaning so many different things. It could be an issue of identity, or it could be literal. It could be the idea of displacement. But I just found that so fascinating, all the different connections that this has.
It's always been fascinating to me how artists work, how artists compose, how authors write. Like I loved going to Ernest Hemingway's home and just sitting in his studio and thinking, how did he come up with the words he did? He was such an eccentric man. Or a painter. I love sitting in an artist's studio. So to have a little glimpse of your work process, and honored that you would try something new on us, on Leo and I, or Leo and me, I should say, proper English. That was really exciting to see. But
yeah, thank you so much for giving me that opportunity. It's so rewarding to be to write for people that you that are your friends, and to work with them, but also to have the opportunity to workshop your piece. And that's so valuable. You were just talking about how contemporary composers get so little rehearsal time, and it's true. And we also get no workshop time, very rarely, especially in larger contexts. But to have that opportunity to workshop something, it's just invaluable. There's so much we learn, so much we learn. So
I think, like when you say large group, I imagine like just playing in the Boston Symphony and how much time is actually allowed for workshopping. There isn't actually. I mean, I think the demands for a composer to have the finished product and not be able to change that is not really nurturing, not a nurturing environment, right?
I mean, one of my first composition teachers always used to say that the piece is not complete until after its premiere, because that's when you really get to go back and make changes and find out the things that didn't quite work in the piece. And it's really true. And I think that's one of the amazing things about the piece I wrote for the Philadelphia Orchestra, is that we had the opportunity to workshop. I think that's so rare for orchestral music, and it should really be the norm, especially when we're talking about an orchestra. When, as contemporary composers, there's been a divide between composers and orchestras since the 20th century for various reasons, which we won't go into. So composers have been writing less and less and less for orchestras. And to kind of bridge that gap, it's really important to have that workshop process for us to kind of hear our ideas. And, every hall is different, every orchestra is different. So you could write the balance in a certain way and think that it's going to work amazing for the French horns, but then hear it in the hall and it's not there at all.
Yeah, well, our friend Gabriella Elena Frank pushed for that workshop, didn't she? Workshopping process.
Yes.
Good for her, right? She's been an amazing force in making changes to our industry.
And just the wisdom of having been down this path, I think, every time she has told me something, I just find it prophetic. But it's happened exactly as she said. So yeah, it's invaluable. I'm so blessed to have her mentorship.
Well, I'm glad that she brought us together.
Same here.
I'm really thrilled to have you on this project. I really appreciate your voice in it.
Thank you so much, Lucy.
Okay. Bye.
Bye. Bye. Have a